Welcome, children of darkness, to Dante's disciples. I, your humble narrator, will guide you through realms of nightmares where shadows whisper secrets and fear reigns supreme. Step out of the light and into the cold embrace of darkness. The world behind you fade, and the unknown beckons. Here every whisper and creak is a prelude to tear. There's no turning back now. You are among the chosen, brave enough to face the horrors that others fear to even imagine. Come closer. Let the darkness consume you. Welcome to Dante's disciples. They weren't the worst thing in the world. I remember as a kid hearing about them. They were just stupid bugs. They were blind and would fly into things. They made for an easy target for a little boy on a bike. Sure, their noise as a collective was rather annoying, but they were harmless. They were harmless. What I wouldn't give to have them back. April 9th. It was spring. Well, pre-spring if there's such a thing. It was that weird period between winter and actual spring where you get a stretch of beautiful weather that's just long enough to fool you into believing winter is over, only to be met with a few inches of snow and about a weekend in the low 40s. Everything was wet and muddy, but the news was already talking about them. They hatch every 18 years, or so we thought. I swear these things hatch more often. It surely hasn't been 18 years since I've heard them. The summer of cicadas, the local news would proclaim. The summer of cicadas, the local news would proclaim. Those loud and pesky insects would be the death of my wife's garden. That was something she took pride in. See, we live in the country. Our closest neighbor was a few acres away at this farm across the road from us. Aside from that, we were surrounded by cornfields and woods, with a few acres of our own to grow on, so why wouldn't we take advantage of it? And I gotta hand it to her. Those heirloom tomatoes are the best I've ever had. This year, I'm going to temper with some hot peppers. I've been doing some research on how to make fermented hot sauce. Our garden always yields more than we can eat ourselves or give away to friends and family. I figured, let's try to get creative with canning different things. But that all might have to wait now. The news says they eat the roots of plants during the nymph stage, likely making our garden a buffet for them. That was still weeks away. Though, growing up, I remember the one hot summer we had to deal with them. My grandparents had a swimming pool in their backyard. They too lived in a rural area surrounded by trees. I guess that's where my love of the country began. I couldn't stand the hustle and bustle of city living. My grandparents' house always felt like home. Even that summer when they showed up in great numbers, swimming in the pool at dusk, the trees were alive with their unnerving hiss. It wasn't a hiss, though. I'm not really sure how to describe it, but some nights it was unbearably loud. It made it hard for a kid to camp in the backyard with his friends. I wonder what this year's crop will bring. Would it be another overblown prediction? Would it be worse than the summer when we had as kids? That year set the bar pretty high. Good luck walking around outside in the summertime without stepping on one. They were so creepy looking. I know they're virtually harmless, but I just didn't like them. They grew to be a few inches long, the size of most adult thumbs. It was just not something I looked forward to dealing with again. May 14th. Grass cutting season was in full effect. We had a few acres, so it became pretty time-consuming as the year went on. Sometimes I would have to cut the grass 2 or 3 times a week to keep it under control. That is if the rain held off enough to allow me to do that. It always had a way of raining the day I was planning on mowing. I did begin to notice them more and more now. They seemed larger than I remembered as a kid. Usually it's the other way around. You remember things larger as a young person, but these seemed bigger, almost like they were full size before hatching from their shell. The news had retracted its initial prediction on the so-called invasion. I guess the numbers weren't as vast as they initially thought. I wonder what constitutes a swarm. Regardless, this was going to make for Memorial Day to remember. Since we had the space to host everyone, our friends would gather at our house. There would be a bonfire to end the night. It wasn't uncommon to see a yard full of tents from those too tipsy to get behind the wheel. We were getting older though. Most of our friends put the hard partying days behind them and traded them in for play dates with their parents. With everyone's schedule being so hectic lately between sports and camping trips, we all decided this year would be special. We were going to make this a weekend-long event, and we were going to roast a pig. I hadn't done one on my own yet, but I had been a part of many when I was growing up. My family hosted a pig roast every summer and coined it Summer Bash. Hell, one summer my great-grandmother thought a mixed drink was Kool-Aid and helped herself to a little too much. Let's just say we were all thankful for my dad stepping in before the stripping could commence. This party wouldn't be like that. Hopefully. Sheedy had already dug out the pit and was trying to get ahead on firework. It was still a few weeks away, but these things did have a way of sneaking up on you. Memorial Day. The weekend had finally arrived. The unofficial start to summer was here, and the yard had never looked better. As usual, the Summer of Cicadas was a dud. I hadn't seen or heard one in almost a month. Jake was on his way to scoop the pig, partially because he was the only one with a truck. The weather looked like it was shaping up to cooperate with us, and I couldn't wait to get the festivities started. Liz was on her way to the store to make sure we had plenty of beer and ice for the weekend. There was a beer store and a gas station within a few miles of our house. I had the feeling we'd be making multiple trips throughout the course of the weekend. The guests began to arrive, and I pointed out the perfect spots for them to set up their tents. Along the cornfield that neighbored our property ran a line of tall trees that offered premium shade during the day. With us running shifts overnights to keep eye on the pig, sleep would be a priority during the day tomorrow. We could easily accommodate 6 large tents on that side of the yard alone. One by one, the families trickled in and parked in the front yard. Obviously, the children were tasked with carrying the small stuff towards their empty campsite. It was shaping up to be a beautiful weekend. 10:38 p.m. What a great start to this Memorial Day pig roast. The coals glowed bright orangish red under the spinning swine. Fat dripping from the skin sizzled as it struck the coals. The kids were winding down after a day of playing in the sun. Somehow, they still had enough energy to play flash tag in the backyard. The beers were flowing and the fellows were reminiscing about past adventures. We were foolish to think that the last beer run would last us the weekend. Empty beer cans stacked up around the outer rim of the fire pit. The wives were inside, all cozied up with their wine, undoubtedly complaining about our childish antics from earlier that night. My watch wasn't until 3 a.m., so I figured I'd try my best to try and get some rest. I walked clumsily towards my tent. The other dads sent their kids to their tents as well. I wasn't going to sleep well tonight. I had accepted that, but I had to try. I could hear the low bass from the Bluetooth speaker pumping out some hip-hop from our high school days. It made it all the more difficult to try and get some sleep knowing I was missing out on one of those nights. The kids in the tent nearby were giggling and talking quietly amongst themselves. They were just loud enough to be a distraction. I was so used to the white noise of a fan when I slept that I often found it hard to fall asleep in a tent. 1:15 a.m. I guess I drank more than I thought. I must have dozed off. What a weird dream I had. I had a dream I was floating, kind of bobbing like you would in the ocean. I sat up in the tent and checked my phone. 1:15 in the morning. I still had almost 2 hours to try and sleep. I must have really had too much to drink. I felt like I was bobbing in that dream. A high-pitched scream tore through the darkness. I ripped my tent open, stumbling out of it as I ran towards the source of the scream. It was the kids' tent. The other dads came running from the fire pit towards the tent to see what was happening. Maybe it was just a bad nightmare. The kids came pouring out of the tent, practically trampling each other to escape from something. Jack shone his flashlight inside the tent, and our faces twisted with disgust. Cicadas had eaten through the lining of the tent and crawled inside with them, and there were a lot of them, probably 20 or so from the hole that we could see. After we settled the kids down, Jake told them to go in the house and camp out in the living room. I still played video games, and I had no doubt they'd be turning those on to help cope with their traumatic wake-up call. Mark and Jake chalked up their old camping gear as a loss. They did well for themselves, so it wasn't a stretch they'd replaced their entire setup. We all had a little laugh at how ridiculous the situation was, and I headed back towards my tent to try and get some more sleep. No sooner did I crawl back into my sleeping bag after having zipped my tent shut, did I feel something under my bag. I tore my sleeping bag open and shot up out of it. I flipped it over to reveal a similar number of cicadas now in my tent. Is that what woke me up in the first place, I wondered? I got out of my tent rather hastily. I decided to pull my tent off the ground and find the source of this. Jake had the flashlight ready for the dramatic reveal, which unfortunately didn't disappoint. There had to be double the amount of what we saw in the kids' tent now. They just kept crawling out of these holes. Holes that weren't there earlier in the day. Mark ran over to the kids' tent and pulled it up. There were too many to count. What was happening? Was the summer of cicadas finally upon us? We quickly tried to gather a game plan together. It was the middle of the night, and we had another 12 hours or so on the pig. We had to make this work. Mark and Jake ran towards their tent to look for any signs of cicadas in or around them. Luckily, neither one of them were subject to the newfound invasion. I had a wheelbarrow full of dry wood near the still spinning pig. We decided to dump the barrel and steal some of the hot coals from the fire to pour down these holes. Cicadas were still coming out of them at a steady rate. There were now a few hundred by my estimate, so we had to act fast. The sun had a way of slowly cooking the occupants of any tent in its path. Last night's events were strange to say the least. I wouldn't soon forget the sound they made when the coals made contact with the cicadas. We couldn't tell if the hiss came from them or if it was just contact with the cool, wet ground. We had planned on investigating the carnage after everyone woke up. What even happened last night? Cicadas don't eat through tents. They're harmless. They feed on plants and trees. Or so I thought. A few too many beers with your friends with minimal sleep will end up in a hangover most times. After I grabbed some coffee and aspirin, I made my way back towards the pig. It sounded like the fat was really dripping off it now. I could hear the sizzling from the porch. When I arrived back at the fire pit, I noticed it was moving. Wait, the fire pit was moving? Why was the fire pit fucking moving? I thought to myself. The cicadas had tried to come up from underneath the fire pit. One by one, they met their demise, but that didn't stop the onslaught. The others pushed the seared carcasses up just a little bit further, only to meet the same fate. Was this gonna stop? I grabbed the fire poker and moved some coals over the top of it. It was too early in the morning for this shit, I thought as I walked towards the woodpile. I threw a few logs on the fire. You never want a big fire for a roast pig. Just enough to keep the coals hot and consistent. 4:38 p.m. The pig was off the spit and on our picnic table. We laid a brand new tarp lined with some heavy-duty plastic out to try to catch the juices. All three of us were experienced cooked, one a former chef, so breaking down the animal wasn't a problem. The problem was the heat from the animal. The skin concealed the heat so well that it made it almost impossible to handle with your hands, even with gloves on. I found it pretty difficult to try and pry the meat from the animal. It was delicious, though. The smoke flavor came through just enough, and it was incredibly juicy. We all tried our best not to gorge on the tasty pork. The day was shaping up beautifully, even in the aftermath of last night's events. It didn't take long for everyone to eat more than they should have. The pork was spectacular. Jake's new girlfriend, whose name is escaping me at the moment, won us over with some killer mac and cheese. I mean, it was top notch. We tried warning the kids to chill out for a bit before going back out to play, but kids will be kids. They love going back towards the woodline and going out on little adventures. I love that they could use their imagination and have fun without having to rely on technology, like so many other kids their age. Not to say they didn't indulge in it from time to time, but their world didn't revolve around it. This is it, I thought to myself. I was looking at the very definition of the American dream. We were surrounded by great friends who loved and cared for us. We were so fortunate to have them in our lives for so long, that they were just considered family at this point. The fact that all these years later we could still make time to have a weekend like this is remarkable. And I loved every minute of it. June 26th. It all seemed so long ago. The idea of life before this was almost unfathomable. We'd been dealing with the new normal for a few weeks now, but it felt like an eternity. The roast pig was just the beginning. Thankfully, it held off long enough for us to enjoy one last cookout. No one could have foreseen what was coming. We all just assumed it was going to be like every other year. The media tends to get carried away with sensationalized stories. I mean, who really cares about a bunch of bugs? It's nothing we haven't dealt with before, but I doubt even they'd take the credit, because this brood was different. Typically, a brood will emerge across 15 or so states. This one had been documented in at least 27. More than half the country. They were bigger than previous broods. They fed on plants and trees almost like carpenter bees. I think I heard some places even declared a state of emergency from blackouts. They emerged from the ground in the billions. They were bigger. faster, hungrier than anything we had seen. Their appetite was seemingly insatiable. Supply trains around the country were shut down due to local farms being ravaged. Here, though, they hadn't quite reached those levels. Gabriel's was a farmer market up the street from us. It was pretty popular throughout the year. Honestly, it was more of a burden in the fall. They held a 6-week pumpkin festival that backed up traffic for miles. Once that was over, it was time for Christmas tree season, and that wasn't much better. But it was nice to have our local convenience store. They've been shut down for a week now, a true sign of the time lived in. They couldn't grow enough product to sustain their demand, so they had to supplement with other farms. With everything going on, it was impossible for them to keep their shelves stocked. Sad, really. The sound was getting worse. It had been almost a month since the pig roast. I miss our old normal. What I wouldn't give to go back to that weekend. July 17th. I was on my way to work one morning before Independence Day when it started. Cars were driving with their hazards on because it was so hard to see. I had never seen anything like it. No one had. This was the end of the world type stuff. The wipers couldn't keep up as these things pelted my windshield. I did make it into the office. Unbeknownst to me, it'd be my last time. We tried calling some of our clients, but we soon noticed the phones were down. We couldn't send any emails or even text to our loved ones. The lights began to flicker in the large office building. I remember our boss gathering us in the conference room and telling us to take a long weekend so this could blow over. Only it didn't. They never left. Imagine leaving your house in a heavy rain. Your face is being pelted and every inch of you is soaked. Well, that was our reality. Except with these cicadas. They were everywhere. They'd smack you in the face and head. While you're busy swatting them away, they'd land on you and start crawling down your shirt or up your pants. It was disgusting. There were just so many of them that you couldn't evade them. I remember finally getting to my car and slamming the door. At least a dozen of them were on me or in the car. I frantically swatted at them so I could proceed to my house where my wife and dog waited. I didn't notice as many cars on my way home, but that didn't mean I was able to drive any faster. It was the equivalent of a whiteout. My windshield wipers furiously tried to keep them at bay as I had them turned up to their highest setting. It was no use. I just had to go slow. Upon arriving home, I had to make another dash towards the house, fighting my way through the horde that overtook our front yard. They crunched and squelched under my feet as I ran to the door. What few managed to sneak in the door with me were quickly dealt with. I hated these fucking things. Our yard was beautiful. It was our sanctuary that we worked so hard to build up over the years. The garden, the landscaping, all of it gone because of these fucking cicadas. Thankfully, things weren't as dire at our house as they appeared at my job. We still had power, and were still able to use our phones. That brief moment of security fled as the emergency broadcast system alert message blared through our phones. And that was it. Shortly thereafter, we lost service and essentially connection to the outside world. We lost power for good a few days ago. The generator kept us going for almost a week. We used it sparingly to try and preserve our food for as long as possible, but there was no way we could make it anywhere in these conditions. They pummeled the outside of the house. It was so loud it sounded like heavy hail, and this would last for hours. Sometimes while also dealing with the buzzing and the hissing. The days and nights blended together because of how many there were. It was impossible to sleep. Every once in a while, a glimmer of sunlight would flash through the swarm of cicadas, but mostly, we lived out the last few days in darkness. This was a plague. I am not a religious man, but I believe it now to be the end of days. I'm writing this in hopes that if anyone finds this, they can document what happened to us. Maybe it'll help piece together the picture. I'm not sure what time of day it is. The never-ending sound of buzzing and hissing has driven us to our bedroom. The noise was deafening now, even with us posted up in the bedroom with our dogs. There wasn't anything else we could do. The sound of them pelting the siding of our house was exchanged for the sound of them eating right through our home. I can hear their mandibles crunching through the roof and the siding. I'm done writing for now, as I want to spend what's left of my time here on Earth with my wife. I don't know if this is truly the end, but I can't see a light at the end of this tunnel.